Now, I would like to preface something very important. I am not an authority figure and an expert on autism. I am not a social coach or a psychologist, and I do not actually know how to treat or handle somebody with autism. What I am about to say in my core argument are just my subjective opinions and only my subjective opinions. That is all. In today's topic of analyzing Christian, I would like to analyze Chris's intelligence. Most people have been talking about Chris's intelligence in a bad light. Negative words that I cannot see on YouTube anymore, because YouTube may mistakenly believe that I'm trolling Chris, which I am not. I'm not a troll. I'm not a bully. These are just my subjective opinions, like I said. And I would like to say, in my subjective opinion, that I humbly disagree with what most people say about Chris's intelligence. Because most of those people who talk to Chris, like the quote-unquote trolls, do not know autism/Asperger's syndrome. I'm someone who knows autism. I have a somewhat understanding about autism and how autistic people may or may not think. And to my understanding with intelligence and autism, intelligence in an autistic brain works differently. And I'm going to tell you my theory and hypothesis of the autistic brain, what I think it is. So if you're wondering about citations and sources, just to let you know that these are my subjective theories and opinions and hypotheses. Alright? As I was saying, I believe that when it comes to the brain of an autist, I do not view the autistic brain like a giant clump. I theorize that the autistic brain works in different areas. Like, we all know at this point with the understanding of the brain that there is the cortex, there is the balance of the brain, and there is the reasoning and problem solving of the brain. We all know that. And I would like to argue that when it comes to the brain of an autistic, one area of the brain is that of a 6-year-old, another area is that of an 8-year-old, another area is that of a teenager, another area is that of an adult, and another area, sadly, is that of an old person. That is what I would like to argue about the autistic brain. But of course, I also would like to argue that these are not set in stone. Of course, different autistics excel differently and have different interests, naturally. So one area of an autistic's brain might be an 8-year-old, but that isn't true for the autistic who sits next to her or him. And Chris's mental maturity and social intelligence is indeed that of an 8 or a 12-year-old, indeed so. But just because Chris's mental maturity is 8 or 12 years old, that doesn't mean that Chris is of an 8 or a 12-year-old in all of the other areas of the brain. No, I don't think so. I only think it is just Chris's mental maturity, and that's it. In other parts of Chris's brain, they are not 8 or 12 years old in the areas of, problem solving and figuring out puzzles and web design and what have you. And also, another area of Chris's brain that is 8 or 12 years old is when they draw the comics, the Sancho comics. Yeah, that too is indeed someone who is around 8 or 12 years old. Indeed so. Now, there was this one guy who was interviewed on the Base Shaman's channel, and he said something to the effect of, and I am loosely quoting the man, loosely quote, Chris gets infinite amount of flack and just hate that is intense. I couldn't handle it. I can barely handle, somebody on Twitter saying I'm stupid or something like that. I couldn't. It's kind of amazing how Chris can just still function and not just crumble. Close loose quote. And then a little bit later on, the same guy answered his own question by saying, quote loose quote, Chris is not completely in touch with reality. Like the cultural societal norms that we have, there's one thing about pushing boundaries and breaking taboos and stuff, but then there's just imposing your own will, your own ideas, your own way on everyone else. It's disrespect, and I do feel disrespected. I definitely do. Close loose quote. And then the guy points out how Chris is going outside despite all of the trolling online. Now, even though the guy answered his own question, I have an explanation to why, Chris goes outside despite all of the trolling, quote unquote. You see, Chris has autism, yes, and Chris has been open about it, and it isn't that too uncommon for some autists to be out of touch with reality, just like what the guy said. But, it shouldn't be that way. You see, when Chris was little, Chris didn't receive the kind of a help that they should have received from their much older parents and from the system in America. So, no. Most of the time, when it comes to the way Chris thinks, behaves and what they say, I don't blame Chris's autism. Even if Chris themselves says, quote, loose quote, I do what I do, say what I say, and everything else because of my mental block of autism. It's solely because of my autism. Close loose quote. No, I actually don't take Chris's word for it for what they do most of the time. The core problem also lies in that Chris's parents didn't want to believe it. Chris's father seemingly wanted to believe that if Chris would be around normal kids in a normal classroom, then by some miracle, Chris would adapt to their surrounding and be a normal kid. But as we all know, things didn't really play out like that as Chris's dad had imagined. Chris did not learn from their environment. Chris did not adapt to all of the normal kids in school or play any kind of a ball game except basketball in high school, and Chris was still socially maladjusted. But I think, in my opinion, that it has to do with the fact that the word itself, adaptability, Chris don't know what that means or didn't know what that meant back then. And the fact that the concept, word and idea in itself, adaptability, comes off as an alien word to Chris, that too, isn't that so uncommon for some autistics, I'm afraid. Yeah, and that's why Chris was in a desperate need of receiving help from the state. Or as a matter of fact, Chris's parents actually did give Chris a speech therapist. And that was the only saving grace they gave Chris, a speech therapist. But sadly that just wasn't good enough, I'm afraid. Another part of Chris's intelligence that I'd like to point out is when Gamer from Mars tried to interview Chris, but then Gamer from Mars realized that whenever he asked Chris a question about their past, Chris would recite the Geno Samuel documentaries. Chris is a fan of Geno Samuel, and Chris just absorbs everything they see on the Geno documentary and just recites that. And the fact that Chris absorbs the Geno documentary like that isn't unusual. That's what Chris did when they were a kid and watched TV. When Chris was a kid, they didn't have access to any real friends, even as a kid. So where is Chris going to receive all of their information from the real world? How to interact and how to talk and say radical things and be all hip and cool and say no to drugs and stuff. Where is Chris going to get all of that information? From the TV. And cartoon shows back then had to have a public service announcement and be like, hey kids, drugs are actually bad for you. And I would like to say thank you to the YouTube channel Break the Rules for informing me about that. Now, I'm somebody who wouldn't know about the 1980s when Chris was born. I'm a 90s baby. But yeah, the fact that Chris air finger quotes culturally appropriates pop culture from the TV isn't anything unusual in some autistics. Like, somebody actually found a pose Chris did, which looks like a Goku Super Saiyan pose. I think the pose may have been from the Namek saga. I guess. So the fact that Chris, or when back when Chris was a kid, absorbs what they see on the TV and consciously or subconsciously impersonate that, isn't that too uncommon for autism? Most, or maybe some autistic kids will absorb what they see on the TV or on the internet or on YouTube. And I don't think I have an explanation for that. I think the explanation for reciting what they see on TV is maybe they think the super cool Dragon Ball movie they saw on TV was so cool that they want to show it off to their friends, maybe, or whoever is willing to give them attention, maybe. Another thing that I would like to point out is when Gamer from Mars talked about Chris's unusual combination. Gamer from Mars said, loose quote, Christian being very gullible and naive but also smart at the same time. But that's another interesting aspect to it, is to get somebody like Chris they have to be gullible and believe stuff, then you can convince them of crazy things. But also at the same time, they have to be competent enough to where they could, close loose quote, because Review Tech USA chimes in between and he says, act out. But then Gamer from Mars keeps on talking and says, quote, loose quote, make YouTube videos, design websites. That's a very unusual combination. Most people, if they are that gullible, they don't have the mental capacity to do that other stuff, but in the case of Chris Chan, they did. Close loose quote. And to Gamer from Mars, I would like to say, oh no, that isn't unusual at all. It isn't. I mean, that ties into my theory about the autistic brain. Different areas of the brain of an autist works differently, like I said. So I actually do not see it as a strange thing that one area of the brain in Chris works like a teenager, another area is like an adult, another area is like a 8 or a 12-year-old. That is Chris's aforementioned mental maturity. But just like Chris's mental maturity is that of an 8 or a 12-year-old, that doesn't mean Chris is stupid. I don't think so. It just means that Chris is socially inept. That's it. And if I gave Chris like a hobby, for instance, here you go Chris, take this educational book and learn to program, then Chris probably would learn to program, but Chris still would have the mental maturity of an 8 or a 12-year-old still. And yeah, the way Chris behaves on the internet does make it look like Chris wouldn't be that smart. But Chris is. But not Chris's mental maturity, I'm afraid. And could we also talk about that time when Chris, oh my goodness, sold their adult movies? Yeah, their adult movies, and oh my goodness, I can't believe it. But this also ties into that guy that was interviewed on Base Shaman's channel, that Chris doesn't think about the consequences at times and isn't really aware about the social taboos we have in our society and what you should and should not do. And that's not just a Chris thing. It isn't. It is also an autist thing. So yeah, the fact that an autistic person, a teenager or an adult, would talk about adult movies isn't really that unusual. It isn't. I mean, that autistic person doesn't care how they look like in public. But again, if Chris's parents had listened to the system and given Chris the correct kind of a treatment, then most of this could have been avoided. And that's why Chris isn't most of the time self-aware what you should and what you should or should not do, like selling your adult movies. Wait. Another thing I would like to say about Chris's reasoning skills is when Chris mistakenly believes almost everything and everyone is a conspiracy theory. Like, there has been times when Chris mistakenly believes that the whole world is out to get them and that there's a trolling conspiracy against them, Chris believes. Now, it isn't true that the whole world is out to get Chris. That's just a conspiracy theory. But as for the trolling part, when people talk about Chris online, especially in groups, that isn't so further away from the truth actually. Though people talk about Chris, it isn't exactly in a cartoony way Chris believes they do, with capes and hoods and gatherings and stuff. No, that's not how it is in the real world, I'm afraid. But that's what Chris thinks. And if you'd like to know my subjective opinion, then I'd say the way some autistic think about this when they lose a match or lose something or things didn't exactly go right in their lives isn't exactly anything unusual for some autistic to think like that. We didn't win this ball game because of interference behind the scenes. Somebody sold us out like in the cartoons. And unfortunately some autistic think like that, just like in the cartoons. So it isn't just Chris. Chris isn't the only autistic with this way of thinking. Another thing that I would like to point out with Chris's social ineptitude and intelligence is the way Chris is right now. how they think and how they behave and in overall. I actually mostly blame that on Chris's environment and on their parents. I mean, even though Chris grew up in a fairly moderate background, I think, Chris didn't turn out right half the time, I'm afraid. There are accounts from Chris's half-brother how Chris's mom and Chris's half-brother's stepdad, that is, Chris's father, did not treat Chris's half-brother correctly. But when Chris came into the picture, both Chris's much older parents seemed to have calmed down a little bit, so it looks to me. But they still had no idea how to deal with an autistic kid or a teenager or a young adult. They didn't seem to have a clue most of the time. So I don't mostly blame Chris's autism, which Chris does 100 million times, which is also part of the whole conspiracy theory that I talked about previously with, it isn't my fault, it's the fault of outside interferences of the autism. Yeah, that too is a bit of a conspiracy theory where Chris blames the autism. Like, everything is like a puppet show, where the puppet master is the personification of autism, Chris believes. But to go back to what I was trying to say with Chris's environment and their parents, now I know Chris is very quick to blame their autism, and some of the people and some quote-unquote trolls feel the same way. I know, but that's not the core problem here, or in my opinion it isn't. The core problem, in my subjective opinion, is that Chris's parents didn't give Chris the kind of help they should have received, and so Chris ended up socially stunted mentally. And some people would also argue that Chris has the overall intelligence of a 6-year-old, which I wholeheartedly disagree with, by the way, humbly. One thing about Chris's psyche or psychology, mindset, that I would like to point out is when they repeat themselves. When Chris used to say, "And call me by the name that was given to me by God and the bear conductor." When Chris said stuff like that. I think I have an explanation for that, actually. It isn't that uncommon for some autistics to find something very familiar and do that thing over and over again, as if that one thing is something of a safety blanket. Maybe Chris is at home all day, on the internet, with their parents, at the mall and in that hobby shop, those years ago, because it made Chris feel safe, secure, and happy, I think. And the same thing goes for Chris's gal pals as well. They too made Chris feel safe and secure. But this isn't just an autist thing, I'm afraid. I mean, some normal people want to feel safe and secure as well, but for whatever reason, these repeatable patterns of finding familiar space and feeling safe and secure seems to be very much prevalent in some autistic people, so it looks to me. And remember when I said that Chris blames their autism for what they do most of the time, or at least back then, that too ties in to when I said that some autistics want to find a familiar space, a familiar pattern, and it ties in to the fact that the autism to what they do and what they say and how they think is, in their opinion, a reasonable explanation, so they think. Now, I also would like to talk about Chris's worldview, their perception of women and friends, or rather, Chris's perception of women and what Chris would like in a friend. And I'm going to talk about this in a reverse order, if I may. So when it comes to friends, it isn't that clear to me what Chris really would like in a friend. I mean, Chris strikes me as a kind of a person who would like to have a friend with benefits. And what I really mean by friends with benefit is that Chris, so it seems to me, would like to have a quote-unquote friend that can give them everything. A quote-unquote friend who will always be there for Chris. A quote-unquote friend who will never be disloyal towards Chris. I believe this is the case because of that Trollstone fabrication, that person who said to Chris, "Hey Chris, I would like to relay a message to you from one of your gal pals." And the Trollstone fabrication said something to the effect of, "A lot of us were shocked when we found out how much Chris had changed," that message. And one of the trolls actually responded to one of Chris's gal pals, and the troll said, "No, Chris doesn't really want to have a real friend. What Chris really mean by friend is someone who's always going to be there for them and kiss them from behind." The troll said something like that. And you might be thinking, is this the work of the autism? And to you I say, mostly no. It is just like what I'm trying to argue, that Chris's parents didn't give Chris the kind of a help they should have. That is the mostly the fault of this. Mostly what the autism plays a part in is the way Chris views reality, the way Chris thinks, the way Chris reasons, the way Chris looks at the world. The autism plays part in those areas of the brain. That is true. Chris didn't have any real friends. Chris's dad paid some girls to be friends with them. You see, Chris's father knew that Chris was socially inept. But instead of teaching Chris how to be social, like father and child, or alternatively, hire a social coach for Chris that knows how to coach somebody with autism on how to become more social, Chris's father instead paid girls to be friends with Chris. And Chris back then was none the wiser. Chris simply accepted what was right in front of them. Chris never questioned why making friends back then went so smoothly. Chris just ate it all up. And this tactic of Chris's father paying girls to be friends with Chris, this gave Chris a false sense of confidence. Chris's father made Chris believe that they were more confident and capable than they realized. But sadly no, they weren't, and it doesn't work like that. And Chris's father's idea of paying these girls was only a short-term solution, I'm afraid. It wasn't a long-term solution. For the other thing that I mentioned about how Chris sees in women, when Chris was in school, they had an attraction sign. Oh, I want to have a boyfriend-free girl who is Anglo-Caucasian, who works, who drives a car, and etc, 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 etc. And the dean of students took that sign away from Chris, and understandably so. And if I remember this correctly, Chris got very stubborn, and because of Chris's stubbornness, she suspended Chris. And it makes me think, what does Chris want in a boyfriend-free girl? I know the direct translation is actually a single woman or bachelorette, but since we're talking about Chris now, I want to use some Christian terminologies. But now, years later, when Chris graduated, in one of Chris's videos, Chris said, "Oh, women are so sweet, they're so adorable, they can do no wrong. Us men, we have a tendency for war, and women aren't really like that. Women are so docile," and Chris said stuff like that in that video. And do you want to know why I believe Chris would say something like that? I actually think Chris picked that up from school. Maybe from a radical feminist teacher. Not all feminists, not all of them, but maybe one teacher knew that Chris was an autistic sponge that just parrots whatever Chris sees. And so that one feminist decided to plant that idea in Chris's mind, which I think is very scummy, by the way. But, Chris didn't know any better. Chris was, I think, a teenager back then. And if the teacher says, you men are like this and us women can do no wrong. And if the teacher says something like that, then of course Chris is going to believe it without question. Because Chris is the student and students listen to their teachers. Simple as that. And that's why I think Chris said those words. But nevertheless, as I was saying about Chris's view on women, based on Chris's tellings from how Chris acted in college, in school, and of course, what Chris said and showed in that video. And essentially what Chris is saying in that is that Chris sees women as damsels in distress that Chris can just save from a high tower or from a castle. Something like a Disney movie. Which essentially means that Chris doesn't see women with high respect, if I'm wording that correctly. If I am, any respect or high value of women, it looks and sounds to me like Chris sees women as if they are 6-year-olds or 7-year-olds. That's the way I interpret Chris's video. Now, Chris may not have had the best view on women, even back then, like they were 6 or 7 years old. But that's probably not so unfair after all, since people did the same thing for Chris. Yes, you see, when Chris was a teen/young adult, they had their own group of mercenaries, gal pals, and Chris thought wholeheartedly that they were their friend. And even after graduation, Chris's gal pals were always in Chris's thoughts and prayers. Always. But as we all know now, thanks to that Jolson fabrication, Chris's gal pals didn't feel the same way for Chris. Here, let me read this correspondence from one of Chris's gal pals from 2010. And when Chris's old gal pal says he, him, she is of course talking about Chris, because back then Chris was a man. Now I am not entirely sure when the Tom Girl saga began. I think it may have happened around the time after Chris's father passed away. Now before Chris's father passed away, I think he did know that Chris sometimes cross-dressed or something to that effect. And there is a comic book, by the way. There is a comic book from Sonichu issue 12, how Chris says in one panel, "I feel better wearing skirts," and Chris's father says, "Christian, you are not a girl, go put your pants back on." But cough cough, anyways, as I was saying, correspondence with... Please note, there is no sister. Quote, "Hi, this is going to come out of the blue, but my sister recently met an old friend of yours named Kristen. They became friends as she felt sorry for him, but recently he started acting really aggressive towards her, such as feeling her inappropriately and trying to kiss her. My sister has tried to cut off contact, but Chris just ignores this and deludes her with phone calls and emails. He's even sent her of himself. My sister says that Chris mentions you often obsessively, which is why I tracked you down. What is up with this guy? He doesn't seem all there and wears a creepy medallion he claims gives him powers. And what is the easiest way to get him to back off? If his harassment continues, we'll have no choice but to go to the police." Close quote. And this gal pal of Chris responds with, quote, "I went to high school with Christian. I haven't seen him since. I really can't help you. I guess go to the police? He has autism. People with autism are very sensitive and almost feels as if they are shut off from the world. Just explain to him that you are only his friend. He will understand. But you have to explain that. Sorry, I can't help." Close quote. And then the troll responds to Chris's gal pal with, quote, "Thanks for your help. He's backed off a bit since, but if he arcs up again, to the police I will go. I only came to you because he claims to have had a relationship with you before dumping you or for someone else, for someone called as recently as last year. I didn't know you haven't had contact for years. He makes it sound like you're still begging to be with him." Close quote. And then Chris's old gal pal says, quote, "Wow! I never even had a relationship with him. I am married and I have a son and a child on the way. I never liked Christian in that way. Christian is definitely not my type, nor has he ever been, but I'm glad you guys are okay." Close quote. And then down below there's an update, and on the update it reads, "I later found out he gave birth this day. Sorry. Seriously though, what a trooper." And basically what this old gal pal says in this letter is that she doesn't think so highly of Chris and Chris's intelligence, seemingly. I mean, that's the way I interpret that letter when she says, "But you have to explain it to him," which I translate to mean, "Oh, but you have to explain to Chris. Just have him sit down and explain to Chris. Oh, hey Chris, please, sit down and listen and pay attention to what I'm saying. Please." That's the way that letter sounds to me. And remember what I said that Chris don't have a high view of women? Well, that gal pal from all those years ago who sent a correspondence from 2010s don't seem to see Chris as an adult. And I think Chris's other gal pals feel the same way. They probably saw Chris as a lost little boy. Something like that. Lastly, before I close off today's episode, I would like to talk about the time when the babysitter locked Chris in their room. And when Chris's parents came back home, Chris became a mute for a few years. Chris accidentally became non-verbal. Now, when the babysitter was on the phone, Chris approached her. Chris may have been super happy and puppy-eyed and jumpy and stuff, and they wanted to say something to that babysitter, but she was on the phone. And the babysitter grabbed Chris, I think, and she tossed Chris inside the room and locked the door, I presume. And this episode was very traumatizing for Chris, if I understand this correctly, and what Chris may have thought when they were locked in the room may have been... The reason I'm in this situation is because I was being a bad boy. I tried to talk and my big mouth got me into big trouble. And that means I can't open my mouth anymore, because if I do open my mouth and start talking again, then it means I'm a bad boy and I will be penalized again. That's what I think Chris may have thought. And then when Chris's mom and dad came back home, Chris was on mute for a few years and couldn't speak. And apparently Chris has stage 1 autism, and when you have stage 1 autism, you're supposed to be verbal. Non-verbal autism, I guess, is stage 2 or stage 3, I think. And that didn't need to happen, by the way, with the babysitter. That did not need to happen. The babysitter could have approached Chris and said, Please, Chris, please, just a moment, I'm on the phone, please. I will get to you in just a moment, okay? But sadly, that approach was not taken, and the babysitter decided to lock Chris in the room. Yeah, and the thing with autism is that most autistics or most autistic kids do not understand reward and punishment in the same worldview like a normal thinking kid would. Well, that'll be it for today, I guess. And if there's anything else I want to say about Chris's and the brain, I can't even words now. But if there's anything I'd like to say about Chris versus the brain, then maybe I'll make a part 2 PodVid. So take care and goodbye, everybody.